UI is essential in any game, not just in VR, because you need a way to interact with things such as home menus, settings, pause menus, sometimes even other things such as inventory screens, things such as that. But it's a little bit different in VR because the way you interact with UI in VR, you have to have a visible 3D menu that's somewhere within the world itself. Since you can't really have something that's attached to the screen have it work well like you would be able to do on a desktop. So in this video I'm going to walk you guys through how to set up a user interface within Unreal Engine as well as widget interactions, that way we can actually interact with this UI in the world. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Alright, so I've already gone ahead, I've opened up a project to work in for this tutorial. I decided not to use the default VR template map that you get in Unreal Engine 5 simply because there's quite a bit going on there. So I decided to clear it so that way we have a nice clean workspace to work with for this tutorial. I do also want to note real quick that I am doing this in Unreal Engine 5. However, this will still work in Unreal Engine 4. You might have a slightly different process here and there because you have a slightly different design character and things like that, but it will still be the same process. You'll be using the same components. The layout should be fairly similar in most places, but other than that, you should be able to work in Unreal Engine 4 and follow this tutorial just fine. Alright, so to start out, we're going to go ahead and create our UI first. So let me go ahead and open up the content browser, and what I'm going to do is create a new folder called UI. I can go and jump in here. Now, in Unreal Engine, it doesn't call it UI, it actually calls it a widget blueprint. So if you actually go and right click, we can actually go under user interface and you can actually see there's a widget blueprint. And I'm just going to call this simple UI. Now this is going to handle everything about the UI. It's going to handle the design. If we have any animations or anything that we want to tie to the UI, we can also add in any blueprint code to the UI as well. So I'll go over all that real quick. So if I go and open this up, so this is the overall layout for our UI. We can see we have our main display window here where we can actually look at our UI and how it functions. Then over here on the left we have our palette. This is going to have things like borders, buttons, text, images, anything like that that we would need to place in our UI. This is where you're going to find all those components. We will also be looking at the vertical and horizontal boxes, as I think that those are quite useful to, at the very least, know how to use, especially if you're going to be doing any animations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Right below that we have our hierarchy, and this is pretty self-explanatory. It's a hierarchy. This is kind of where everything that we have in our UI is going to go. So that way we can actually see what's connected to what. Again, this is where we're going to come into the vertical and horizontal boxes again later on. Down here in the bottom we have our animation stuff. So you can see this is where we can actually list all the different animations we can do. I'm not going to do any animations for this tutorial, however, this is where you'll come to do any of that kind of stuff. And along with that, we also have our timeline. This is also tied to our animations, how everything is going to function. We also have our compiler results, which we don't really need to worry about. We shouldn't have anything that we need to compile that should cause any errors or anything like that. Right next to that we have, and then right up here on the right, we have our details, which again, if you've messed around with Unreal Engine, is kind of self-explanatory. It is basically any details pertaining to, for example, text, what font we're using, the size of our font, things like that. We can also, with buttons, change the background color over buttons and things like that. And then right up here, this will look slightly different on Unreal Engine 4, but right up here you should still have a designer tab, and you should also have a graph. And if we actually click on graph, this is where all of our blueprint stuff is. And again, this is pretty similar if you've messed around with blueprint before. It's a very similar, if not the exact same layout. We have our functions, variables, details, our event graph, all that kind of stuff over here. And we'll get into that here in a second as well. Alright, so to start out, we're going to go ahead and actually grab a border. I'm actually going to attach this to the canvas panel. And actually, I do want to size this to content too. Now, you don't have to do this. If you want to have it at a set size or anything like that. You can, of course, set your size. You can set the position, all that kind of stuff. I'm just going to size it to the content. It will slightly resize later on when we actually go to use it, but it won't be too much of a problem. Next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a vertical box. Now this is actually quite important. So when you're working with widgets or UI, however you want to call it, not everything can have more than one child. The border is one example of that. Border can only have one child. Vertical boxes, however, can have as many children as it wants. And if we actually go and grab a button, which I was going to use anyways, we can actually see if we actually try and drag on the border, it won't let us because it says that it can't accept any additional children. It can only have the one. Vertical box does not have this limitation. We can drag as many buttons as we want onto here. I'm going to drag 3 onto here, but again, that's going to be up to you. And then I'm also going to drag some text. And again, if we actually try and drag onto the buttons, you can see again, we can't add any more than one text to our button. So if you want to have anything additional, that's again where I'd come back and say, put it through either a vertical or horizontal box. So we can actually just go and drop that in here. And you can actually see it automatically stacked up one on top of the other. And that's kind of what vertical boxes does. It essentially stacks different widget elements on top of one another. So you can actually see that it's automatically stacked everything one on top of the other. We don't have to do anything additional. However, there is one additional thing that I do want to do. And I do want to add some padding here. I'm not going to add too much here. I'm going to throw like 25 on left and right. And for this top one specifically, I think I want to add like 12.5 to the bottom. Oh, that was top. We'll add some to the top as well. But more specifically, I want some to the bottom. And again here, left 25, right 25, and again to the top and bottom 12.5. I think I messed that up and did not put right. That's fine though. Nice easy fix. And then again here, 12.5. What did I say, 25, right? Yes, 25. 25, and again to the bottom, I'll go and do 12.5. Okay, so we've got now a very basic UI setup. So this is what it's going to look like right now with what we have. You can also see that we can actually fill or anything like that if we want. We can also adjust different how it aligns. Again, like I said, we can adjust the color and opacity, all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to worry too much about all this kind of stuff since I'm just trying to keep it somewhat simple. All right. But next thing we're going to want to do is jump right over here into the text. Now, because I want our UI to actually do something when we click on these buttons, I'm actually going to change what these 3 text boxes say. So in order to do this, I'm actually going to go right into here, into the details of our text. You can actually see that we have an area here where it says text. Then we can manually input text. So we could do like what up or something like that. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go right over into bind. And I'm actually going to not want to create a binding. So if we actually create a binding, this will actually create a function that we can actually modify. But what I'm going to do is actually go right over here into graph. I'm going to create 3 variables here. Now, if I recall, they all need to be text, if I recall. So I'm actually going to change these all to text. And I'm actually going to call this text 1, text 2, and text 3. Oh, I call that text. Text 2 and text. I'm not typing right today. And right over here into the designer. So now if we go ahead and hit down this bind, you can actually see I still ended up renaming that test 1 for 1. But you can actually see that we have all 3 of the variables that we created initially. So I'm actually going to bind this one to test 1, not text 1 apparently. And then we have text 2 and text 3. So this will actually bind so that way whatever's in our variables is what will actually be displayed in there. So if we actually go right over here, I'm actually going to rename this because that's going to annoy me if I don't rename that now. Why? Oh, is it because it's still looking for test one? Yes, it is. My bad. Text one. All right. So that's all the bindings done. So now if we jump right over here, you can actually see that we have text one, text two, text three here. And I'm actually going to just rename, I'm just going to give these all a default value of press me with a little exclamation point at the end. And I'm going to assign this to all three of them. So that way we have values for all this. And I'm actually going to go and get rid of all of this because we're not going to use construct or anything like that. But what I'm going to do is going right over here to the button. If we actually scroll all the way down, you can actually see that we have a whole bunch of different events that we can trigger off of. Now for a widget interaction component, which is what we'll be using in order to actually interact with these buttons, we want to use onPressed. So in order to do this, all we're just going to do is click plus on this onPressed, and you can actually see it's already created our event for us. And before I go ahead and do what I wanted to do with these, I'm just going to go and grab all three of these and just get those events real quick. And there we go. So now using these three, what we're going to want to do is I'm actually going to just rename these texts. That way we can make sure that these buttons are working correctly. So we can actually just drag off of this, and I'm just going to say what up. And this last one I'm just going to say is dude. What up, dude? So, so once we press all these, they should all rename. The text within those buttons should actually rename to what up and dude. So something different for each individual thing. Now, of course, if you want to do something different, you can, of course, go through this. You can do something different for each button press. I'm not going to worry about doing some huge extravagant thing with all these buttons. I just wanted to keep it simple, but of course, you're probably going to want to do something much more complex than this. But that's all that we're going to do with this UI. So now once we press all these three, they'll all change text. So I'm going to go and close this real quick. And I'm actually going to go ahead and open our content browser again. And I'm going to create a new folder. And I'm just going to call this actor. Nice and simple. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new blueprint class called actor. And the purpose of this actor is actually going to be to give us something so that way we can actually see our UI within the world. So I'm just going to call this UI actor and go and open that up. Okay, so we're not going to do too much to this. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a widget, not a widget interaction. We're going to use a widget. And this is just going to be called widget. We're just going to keep it nice and simple. And I'm actually going to replace that as our default scene root. So what this will allow for us to do is once we drop this into the scene, we'll be able to actually go into here and change our widget class. So that way this can actually be used with different UI. And by using this, we'll actually be able to have one actor that's able to use all the UI that we have. And I'll show how that's going to work here in a second. There's one change that I do want to make in here. No, you know, I'm thinking of the widget interaction component. My bad. But I do want to actually go in here and draw a desired size. And the reason for this is what usually ends up happening is you can actually see right here we have a draw size. And when we actually add in a widget class, what it'll actually do is it'll actually create a certain size widget, and it'll fit whatever we have within that widget class within that space. So by doing draw desired size, it will automatically resize to whatever we want to use. In this case, it's going to resize to the size of that border. So by doing this, it will automatically adjust its size so it doesn't look all weird off to a corner or something like that, or maybe it's like cropped off all weird or anything like that. So I'm actually going to drop this into the world real quick so we can actually see how this looks. So that did not pop up. There we go. So I'm actually going to change widget class to simple UI. You can actually see it wasn't visible from that side, and that's because it's facing the wrong direction. So let me go and rotate this real quick. And I'm actually going to raise that out of the ground a little as well. All right, so you can actually see that's actually perfectly sized to our border. It'll automatically resize to the elements that we have within our UI. So that's part of why I added in a border, is we can make sure that it is resizing correctly and we don't have to manually set up some obscure size for our buttons or anything like that. It also makes it nice and easily visible. So yeah. And then the final thing we're going to want to do is we're going to need to modify our player. Now this again is where you're going to run into some differences if you're in Unreal Engine 4. So the first difference you're going to have is I'm just going to be using the VR pawn, because the VR pawn has our motion controllers, our camera, all that kind of stuff. It also already has a widget interaction component attached to each hand, so I'll be showing how to enable those. However, if you're in Unreal Engine 4, you're going to be using the BP motion controller component, or I think it's just called BP motion controller. And that's what you're going to want to modify, since that's where both your hands are. Now, if you want, you can use a motion controller pawn attached to your headset or something like that, so it's based off wherever you're looking. But that can be kind of awkward, and I really wouldn't recommend doing it that way. But anyways, so we don't need any of these graphs or anything, at least not yet. So we're going to go and jump right over here into our viewport. You can actually see, as I said, in Unreal Engine 5, we already have widget interactions attached to our left and right motion controller components. So we don't need to worry too much about that. Now, if you don't have widget interaction components, you can actually just go right in here and just look up widget interaction and just add one in. That's going to be up to you if you don't already have one, like I said. So looking at these, there's going to be a couple quick changes that we want to make. First one we're going to want to make is we're going to want to go right over here to Trace Channel, and we're going to want to set this to, I believe it's World Dynamic if I recall. Let me just double check that real quick. This is, if we go and drop this down, World Dynamic. So that's the reason we want to change the trace channel from, I believe it was 3D World or 3D Object to World Dynamic, is because otherwise it won't actually pick up the collision of the UI. So we need to set to World Dynamic so that way it can actually collide with the UI itself. Next thing we're going to want to do is, some of these are going to be kind of optional depending on what you want to do. So interaction distance, this is going to be how far you want your widget interaction component to trace to. So if you have your UIs pretty far away, then you are of course going to want this to be a lot farther away. If it's a little bit close, then quite frankly it doesn't really matter. It will actually cut down the trace to the point where it hits the UI. So if you want to throw it out to like 5,000, even though you're not even going to go anywhere near that, you can. That's going to be entirely up to you though. Interaction source we can leave alone. We do want to click Show Debug. This will actually make it so we actually see a red line from our motion controller, or in this case our widget interaction component, to wherever the widget interaction component is meant to go. And of course, if we want to go down here, we can actually change a whole bunch of properties of this. We can actually change the sphere line thickness. And what this is once we actually hit a widget itself, then what it'll actually do is it'll draw a little sphere right at that collision to make sure that, just to let you know that it's actually colliding. You don't have to do any modifications to all this. I think all this is pretty good where it's at. So yeah, and we do want to of course do the same thing to the widget interaction right. Now there is one little change that I do want to at the very least draw some attention to, and that's going to be right here at the pointer index. So if you were looking at this, you may have noticed in the widget interaction left, it's a different value than what it is in our widget interaction right. And the reason being is that each widget interaction component within a scene has to have a different pointer index. If you don't have them all different, then it will only take the first one that's generated into the scene, and it will only allow that one specific widget interaction component to function, unless they all have different pointer indexes, which is why we actually have it set up like this. So by doing it like this, we can actually have both of them function correctly. If I were to actually set this back down to 0, then presumably this one wouldn't function. At the very least, one of them wouldn't function, but presumably it'd be the right one. Since this one's probably a little bit lower on the hierarchy, that would be my assumption, is it would be this right one that doesn't function. But yeah, so that's going to be how that works. All right, so now that we have everything set up in our widget interaction components themselves, here in the viewport at least, they should now be able to detect when they're colliding with the UI, and they should be visible within the world so that way you can actually see where you're pointing and what you're hitting and all that kind of stuff. So in order to actually trigger UI elements, we're now going to have to jump over here into the event graph. So I'm actually going to take over these trigger left and this trigger right. Since I'm not using these trigger press, trigger released, and all these elements that they have right now, I'm just going to cut this off here, and I'm just going to drag these down so we can use these down here. And we're going to use our triggers in order to detect, or not to detect, but in order to actually interact with our UI and be able to press on things. So in order to do this, we're going to have to take down both our widget interaction left and our widget interaction right. And I'm going to go and set these right next to those. All right, so in order to actually detect these, we're going to have to run two functions, one on pressed and one on released. So on press, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to do press. And when we type in press, you actually see that we have press and release key, press key, and press pointer key. What we're going to be using is press pointer key. And we're going to want to run that when we actually press down on the trigger. And once we click down on key, you can actually see it actually gives us the options to do a whole bunch of different things depending on what we want to trigger. Because we're interacting with UI, we're actually going to use left mouse button. So I'll basically simulate a left mouse button on a mouse wherever the widget interaction is at. So if it's like in the top corner of a UI, it will simulate a left mouse click button there. If it's down the bottom right, then it'll simulate a left mouse button there. If it's on a button or something like that, it'll simulate a left mouse button there. Now for the released, we're going to want to do release pointer key. And again, we're going to want to set this to left mouse button. Now you do want to make sure that you do release. And the reason for that is if you don't do a release pointer key, what will actually end up happening is once you press down, it essentially won't reset. So you only be able to press on the UI element once, or I guess technically anything once. And you won't be able to click on anything ever again. So it'll be a one-time use thing. Once a release is run, then you'll be able to click on the UI element again. So, and then we're going to go and copy this and just go and bring this down so that way we don't have to worry about copying all of this again. And again with the widget interaction right. And with that, that is all that we really need in order for this to work. So I'm actually going to go ahead and boot this up real quick. As I usually do, I'm on a Valve Index. If you're on a Quest or anything, it should be a very similar process. You should have no issues whatsoever. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. And I have one of my controllers off. All right, so here we are. I think I'm a little bit elevated for some reason, but I'm not concerned with that at the moment. It could just be my perspective on things. So you can actually see these red lines. These are actually the widget interaction components. This is extending out, if I recall, it's 500 units. So you can actually see where you're pointing at. And my right controller just bugged out on me. So you can actually see if we actually go over the UI itself, you can actually see that it does do a little sphere right there. And I can't really see behind the UI very well from this position, but if I were to go over there, then you would be able to see that's not going through the UI itself. You can actually see when we mouse, or when we go right over any of the buttons with either of these, you can actually see that it will actually highlight to simulate that you're mousing over it. So if we actually go ahead and press trigger, you can actually see it says what, and then up, dude. You can also see too it resized itself, and it also maintained a center position. That's part of it keeping to the desired size of the widget class, because the border actually resizes based off of what's in the widget, it actually resized itself, and it maintained center because the actor itself is actually resizing itself to fit the new size. Otherwise, it would have kind of repositioned itself probably up to the left, maybe even just kind of repositioned itself, just kind of squeezed together, but it wouldn't have looked right after that point regardless. And with that, that is how you implement some very simple UI into Unreal Engine using the widget blueprint. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. If you did, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below, and let me know what other tutorials you guys would like to see done in the future. And with that, I will see you guys in the next reality.